I hope you found this morning's session very interesting. I think there was quite a contrast expressed between the presentations that we had on each of the sessions. One thing I just want to mention to everybody is, once again, we have Anthony and his colleagues in support from the HSE. If anybody is finding any element of it during a session, after a session, at a break, Anthony and his colleagues are there available throughout the whole day and tomorrow for giving any supports that people may feel they would like to avail of, and please do. Okay, we're going to move into our next system, which is looking at the whole issue of the prisons and the prison system. And first of all, I'm going to ask Caron McCaffrey, who's the Director General of the Irish Prison Service, to give us her perspective, particularly related to the issue of drugs, drug use and prison services. Thank you, Caron.
Members of the Assembly, distinguished guests and fellow participants, I'm delighted to be here with you today, and I do appreciate the opportunity to address the issue of drug use and the significant challenges that addiction creates for the Irish Prison Service. I would like to start by acknowledging the establishment of the Citizens' Assembly on Drugs, which is very much welcomed and marks a crucial step forward in our collective efforts to reduce the harmful impact of illicit drugs on individuals, families, communities, and wider Irish society. Over 70% of people in custody are experiencing addiction to some form of substances. In the Irish Prison Service, we understand addiction as part of a person's overall mental health status. When we assess somebody, we look at them as a whole person, recognising that their addiction has been their survival mechanism, their coping strategy up until this point. We understand that addiction is not a separate or distinct entity, but rather part of a broader story that defines the person standing before us. We do not view addiction as a disease, but rather as a response to inner turmoil. In our society, addiction is often discussed in two contexts: as a problem to be treated by medical professions, or as a legal issue to be dealt with by the criminal justice system. However, these discussions, in my view, often fail to address the fundamental question of why. Why does addiction become part of someone's life journey? Why do individuals turn to substances as a means of coping? What has happened to that person? It is rare to find somebody with an addiction who has had what they would describe as an ideal life, free from any history of trauma. Each person has their own unique, often untold story of unmet needs that has shaped their journey to addiction. Gabor Mate, in his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, says, "We readily feel for a suffering child, but cannot see the child in the adult who, his soul fragmented and isolated, hustles for survival." I believe this inability to see the broken and traumatized child in the adults before us is what leads us to want to punish rather than treat addiction. As humans, we have a tendency to simplify things and categorize people with labels such as addiction or addict. However, understanding the why behind addiction requires us to develop services that treat each person as an individual, considering their addiction within the context of their entire life experience. That is not an easy task, but it is necessary if we want to provide effective supports and rehabilitation. Within the Irish Prison Service, our clinicians have identified a prevalent factor that surpasses all others in the development of difficulties later in life, including addiction. This factor is known as emotion dysregulation. Emotion dysregulation, as I'm sure many of you already know, is a concept that spans across various mental health difficulties experienced by individuals. The regulation of our emotions is a skill we learn as children, but for some, these skills were not taught or were hindered by adverse childhood experiences such as complex trauma or polyvictimization. In almost all clinical risk assessments completed by our prison-based psychologists, emotion dysregulation is identified as a fundamental part of a person's offending history and is particularly associated with violent crime. Early in life, when overwhelming and confusing emotions cannot be managed, one powerful regulatory strategy becomes the use of substances. Substances numb intolerable feelings of fear, shame, anger, guilt, or uncertainty, becoming the go-to coping mechanisms for individuals who have not had the opportunity to learn healthy ways to navigate their lives, but particularly their emotional responses to life events. Understanding this concept of emotional dysregulation, therefore, is crucial in developing comprehensive and effective supports for people struggling with addiction. People who experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are 15 times more likely to be a perpetrator of violence in the last 12 months and 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated in their life. The average school-leaving age of those currently in custody today in Ireland is 14 years of age. In many cases where children have suffered significant adverse childhood instances or where their parents have their own addictions or mental health issues, children's ability to engage with the formal education system is often impaired. Where a child falls out of the education system, they are much more vulnerable to offending behaviour. I think this figure is particularly sobering and really highlights the need for early intervention. It is no secret, and I think you know this better than I, that drug addiction has and continues to plague our society, affecting people from all walks of life. However, within the walls of our prisons, the problem reaches alarming proportions. As I mentioned earlier, statistics reveal that a staggering 70% or more of individuals committed to Ireland, to prison in Ireland, face addiction issues, and this has a direct impact on the prevention of contraband being trafficked into our prisons. People's drug addictions do not stop at the gate when they are committed to prison, and they will use every method to seek to gain access to illicit drugs in our custody. As a prison service, we are very much committed to strengthening our measures around drug treatment. However, drug-free prisons will only be achievable when we have a drug-free society. Of the 4,162 sentences handed down by the courts in 2022, 78% were for sentences of 12 months or less, and the majority of those offenders were in the throes of active addiction. Research has shown that rehabilitation requires time, consistency, and a holistic approach. Longer sentences allow for the implementation of evidence-based programs that address the root causes of addiction, provide education and vocational training, and offer support for mental health issues. By focusing on rehabilitation, the Irish Prison Service can help to break the cycle of addiction and reduce the rates of recidivism. Conversely, however, short sentences do not allow us in the prison service to address the underlying causes of addiction and severely limits the effectiveness of rehabilitation efforts by our staff. Positively of particular note in the context of short sentences is that in the review of penal policy options for prison and penal reform 2022 to 2024, there are proposals to help strengthen the options available to judges when they are considering cases, to facilitate the effective and efficient use of community sanctions by the courts, and to ensure that courts have a wider range of appropriate options for dealing with people who've committed minor offences. James Leonard, a joint host of the well-known Two Norries podcast, recently shared his experience with me of how a prison sentence did assist him in achieving recovery, and I'd like to share that with you now.
Just one more minute, Caron, please.
When somebody in the throes of addiction is in custody, it is often the only time they will receive adequate health care. When someone is in addiction, they neglect their health. They avoid addressing issues out of shame. When someone is in custody, they have access to free dental care, GP, psychology, nursing, and psychiatry if needed. They would never get this integrated care in the community. In a study done in the University College Cork by Graham Cambridge, he found that desistance followed recovery always. And according to James, crime is a byproduct of addiction. Addressing the addiction in a holistic way is the best way to reduce crime. The issue of drugs is not something that can be solved by a single entity, and certainly not by the prison service. Punishment for drug addiction does not make sense when we understand it as a coping strategy in the context of trauma. We need to find a holistic, community-based structure which can meet the individual needs of a person without them having to come into contact with the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you, Caron.